diverses senses anymore.
Francis was the poor people's pope. He welcomed personal contact with the faithful. Jorge Bergoglio introduced a new style at the Vatican. Almost immediately after his mission, the pontiff from South America set about introducing a number of reforms. He chose his papal name in honor of St. Frances of Assisi, who committed himself to living and teaching as Jesus Christ had done. St. Francis was the son of a prosperous merchant, but in his early 20s, he underwent a spiritual transformation that led him to adopt a life of poverty and gospel. On March 13, 2013, white smoke signalled that the papal conclave had elected a new pontiff. In his first public appearance, Francis came across as humble and unpretentious. He made it clear that his priority was his congregation, and he asked them to pray for him.
As soon as I heard that he'd chosen the name Francis, I knew that new and important things were going to happen. He'd said a very deutliche Ansage.
The new pope was a master of the public gesture, but everything he did seemed natural. He rode on buses, he paid his hotel bills himself, and he declined to live in the papal apartments.
Even before he began his structural reforms, you could see something quite new in the way he treated people. He was humble and uncomplicated. He could interact with anyone, even those on the fringes of society.
I believe that Francis, through his words and his plainly demonstrative gestures, wanted to bring the church back toward its core values. Of course, we cardinals are all getting bogged down with details on things like structural reform and making changes in the Curia. The media and the public are often quite interested in these things, but we have to keep the focus on the key issue, and that is spreading the gospel.
It was a concern that Francis shared with his predecessor, Benedict XVI. Francis deeply respected Benedict and took further steps to tackle child sexual abuse by the clergy and to reform the Vatican's financial system. First of all, Francis ordered a thorough investigation of the Vatican. He created a new post of finance minister and appointed an economic advisory council led by the German Cardinal Reinhard Marx.
Church funds have an auxiliary function, and part of that is to help the poor. Individual churches that are wealthy share that wealth with people who are needy. Catholic churches in Germany do that, for example. At the same time, there's always the danger that the church structures and the National Bishops' Conference will grow stronger and more bureaucratic. I think the Pope tried to focus attention on the key issue.
Soon after his election, Francis made a point of visiting the town of Assisi, the birthplace of his namesake. Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict had both called representatives of the world's religions to Assisi to pray for peace. The symbolic nature of the visit was immediately apparent.
Da questa città della pace.
From this city of peace, I repeat with all the strength and meekness of love, let us respect creation
non
and let
siamo
us not be instruments of destruction.
rispettiamo
Let us respect each human being. May there be an end to armed conflicts that cover the earth with blood.
la terra.
These frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi tell his life story. Francis was born Giovanni di Bonadonna in 1181 or 1182, the son of a prosperous silk merchant. His father prepared Giovanni to follow in his footsteps. He took him on business trips and assigned him tasks of increasing responsibility. The young man learned the silk trade and how to deal with customers. He had no time for poor people. An important source of information about Francis is the legend of the Three Companions. It was written in 1246, 2 decades after Francis's death, by 3 of his followers. One section of the text describes Francis as a free-spending youth. He was on the go through Assisi both day and night. He was quite generous and spent all the money he had on banquets and other things. Francis dreamed of becoming a knight, but to do that, he would have to prove himself in battle. He got his first chance in 1201 when Assisi launched a military operation against the nearby city of Perugia. The troops from Assisi lost the battle, and Francis was taken prisoner. During his captivity, he began to reflect on the life he lived in fire. He was released a year later. In 1204, he suffered a serious illness, which only deepened his spiritual crisis.
What good are fashionable clothes if you are empty inside? What good are parties if they only torment your soul?
Francis recovered from his illness and returned to his profligate ways, but his extravagant lifestyle now seemed increasingly shallow. He began to spend more time by himself, often in local forests, and he found solace in prayer.
Almighty God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and show me how best to serve you.
Francis grew increasingly distant from his family and friends. He often walked through the poor quarters of Assisi and saw firsthand the misery of those who lived there. One day, Francis met a person who was suffering from leprosy, and the experience had a profound effect on him.
I lived for 20 years as though Christ did not exist. I used to think that lepers were disgusting, but God himself sent me to you, and this experience has filled me with love. I will soon abandon my middle-class life.
Francis wanted to devote his life to the needs of the outcasts of society. Before he became Pope Francis, Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio of Buenos Aires also spent time ministering to the poor and disadvantaged, and he urged his priests to do the same. Nearly 13 million people live in the city's metropolitan area. About 80% of them were baptized Catholic, and the number of practicing Catholics is much lower. The spiritual center of Buenos Aires is the Cathedral of the Plaza de Mayo. Latin America has more Catholics than any other continent, but the church's influence has declined. Cardinal Bergoglio was convinced that the church could no longer afford to focus its attention on prosperous believers. He often traveled to the city's poor districts by bus, subway, and even on foot. This slum is located between a highway and a train station. More than 10,000 people live here, not far from hotels and banks. The contrast between rich and poor is remarkable. These districts are often controlled by armed gangs of drug dealers, and the police seem powerless to stop them. Gustavo Carrara knows this district well. His parish is part of the slum known as Villa 11114. The name dates back to the time when the military junta ruled the country. An estimated 45,000 people live here, many of them immigrants from neighbouring countries. The newcomers, mostly from Bolivia, Paraguay and Peru, have held on to their cultural traditions. Jorge Bergoglio supported these efforts.
Our patron saint is Our Lady of Lujan.
Prince, you want some cheese?
These statues of Mary from
Over this way. Okay, you're just gonna take it over.
Here's Our Lady of Copacabana in Brazil. This is a very clear indication of what the Pope meant when he spoke of the devotion of the people of God.
Prince.
People here worship the Virgin Mary and the saints. You can see that everywhere. This district is a miniature version of Latin America. The piety of the people is the basis of all our pastoral work. We have a lot of baptisms and prayer services here. And we celebrate Mass 3 times a day. All of this shows that the church is part of people's daily lives.
Pastoral work includes efforts to make people's lives better. The parish is building a school, since more than 40% of the people who live here are under the age of 17. Education and after-school activities are the best ways to keep young people away from drugs. Activities include a football team, an orchestra, and a music school. The local priest says it's part of his job to help the people of his parish.
Pope Francis often spoke of a poor church, and that means we have to focus on the lives of the less fortunate. Jesus made a point of ministering to poor people. And there's more to it than just being generous with them. You have to make them part of the community and treat them as friends. That takes a lot of commitment. The poor reveal to us a part of God's creation that is unfamiliar to us because we come from a different social strata.
Father Bergoglio's work in this community had a profound influence on him. Even after he became Pope, he maintained many contacts here. The pontiff sent letters and even talked to some of the young people by phone. Pastor Jose Maria de Paola has worked in poor communities since 1997. Jorge Bergoglio visited him often.
Pope Francis believed that we have got to help poor people, but he also said that we can learn from them. When he was still in Buenos Aires, his sermons and his pastoral work were focused on the poor. He said that we were obligated to help them, and stressed that the poor also had something to teach us.
Pastor Jose says that Father Bergoglio's philosophy could be summed up as keep one ear on the gospel and the other on the people. Bergoglio urged priests and bishops to follow his example of community service. He demonstrated this by washing the feet of the faithful.
I was particularly impressed by the fact that Pope Francis visited refugees on the island of Lampedusa, just like he visited poor people here in Buenos Aires. He told immigrants from Paraguay, Bolivia and Peru that they were welcome here and had a home here. He called on us to share what we had with them.
Thousands of refugees have died trying to cross the Mediterranean from Africa to places in Europe like Lampedusa. Pope Francis visited the island in July 2013. He paid tribute to the victims and called the attention of wealthy Northern European countries to the EU's refugee policies and to the plight of desperate people. Francis openly criticized Europe's approach to the crisis.
Our society has forgotten how to weep. We have forgotten how to show compassion. Indifference has spread around the world.
Nobody.
and it has robbed us of our ability to weep.
Allora è politico perché è andato
Was the Pope's visit to Lampedusa a political act? No. He went there as a pastor, but he did make a gesture that was political in character. He'd been a bishop in Latin America, and the concept of a church that would interfere in politics was foreign to him.
per influenzare la politica da parte del
That work should be left to laymen, with all their knowledge and experience.
cristiani, con le loro coscienze illuminate.
St. Francis of Assisi was anything but a political revolutionary. But he could not find in a secular existence the spiritual answers he was seeking,
Right.
nor did he find them in the Catholic Church of his time, with its magnificent cathedrals and ostentatious hierarchy. One day near Assisi, Francis came across the chapel of San Damiano, which had fallen into disrepair. Inside the chapel, an icon of Christ crucified caught his eye. This was the God he'd been looking for, not an almighty ruler of the heavens, but a mere mortal hanging on the cross. The text compiled by the three companions says that this discovery was a major turning point for Francis. He began to pray to this image, and then he heard a voice. "Francis, do you not see that my house is falling apart? Go forth and rebuild it." Francis was amazed and said, "Yes, Lord, I will do it." That message from God filled him with joy and spiritual light, and he was able to feel the presence of Christ crucified in his heart. Francis made a radical break with his past. He renounced his inheritance and gave away his possessions. He had stolen some expensive cloth from his father and sold it to raise money to rebuild the chapel. His father led Francis before the local bishop, who ordered him to give the money back. Francis did this and then stripped out of his clothes and gave them to his father. Francis said, "From now on, I can turn to God and call him my Father in heaven." Pietro was outraged at this turn of events, but could do nothing to stop his son. Francis wanted to live in poverty, as Jesus had done. He found a patron in the Bishop of Assisi. Jorge Bergoglio was born in Buenos Aires in 1936. He graduated from secondary school with a diploma as a chemical technician. The travel guides describe Buenos Aires as a city that is beautiful and chaotic at the same time. Every district has its own individual character. Immigrants from Europe brought their traditions with them. Bergoglio himself was the son of Italian immigrants. The cultural diversity of Buenos Aires made a lasting impact on him. He developed an interest in literature and the traditional music of Argentina. The port district of La Boca used to be one of the city's poor districts. Today it's filled with fine houses and cafes and tango bars that draw tourists from all over the world. Bergoglio grew up in the neighborhood of Flores. The Church of San Jose is located not far from his parents' house, and it was the scene of an event that would change the young man's life forever.
It was the 21st of September. For some reason, I felt compelled to go to the church in Flores. I felt something inside me, but I can't describe it. I saw a priest whom I didn't know. I don't know what happened next. I felt as though someone had got hold of me inside. And then I said to myself, I must become a priest. I had no doubt at all.
Bergoglio finished his seminary studies and entered the Society of Jesus in 1958. He was ordained in 1969. The Jesuits made him a provincial superior in Argentina in 1973. In 1980, he was named rector of the Philosophical and Theological Faculty of San Miguel. Brother Mario Rauch was one of Bergoglio's students.
There are two inner courtyards here. One of them is for the School of Theology. When Bergoglio was the rector, he often came here to meditate. I'll show you his room. It's just as it was when he left. This is the desk he used. And here is his bedroom.
The Society of Jesus was founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1539. It became Father Bergoglio's spiritual home.
His approach to church affairs was shaped by the Jesuits. The discernment of spirits, clear judgment, extensive deliberation, attention to the signs of the times, and most of all, perception of reality. The Pope and I discussed this on one occasion. We agreed on the obligation to perceive reality as it is, as St. Ignatius told us to do, and to find God in all things. Before we take action, we must understand what drives us as human beings and be aware of history.
His secretary was reported to have said that the Pope made important decisions only after extensive prayer. That's typically Ignatian. Not just Jesuitic, but Ignatian. It's deeper.
During Argentina's 1976 coup, most of the country's bishops did not speak out against the persecution, kidnappings and murder of the junta's opponents. Bergoglio worked behind the scenes to help those who were in danger. He was no hero, but he was also not a collaborator.
If he had spoken out, who would have listened? He was just another Jesuit at the time. He wasn't a cardinal or a bishop. But he did help some people.
Bergoglio was appointed auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires in 1992 and became the city's archbishop 6 years later. He continued his pastoral work, founding parishes in poor districts and consecrating soup kitchens. Bergoglio was created a cardinal in 2001 by Pope John Paul II. He set about learning how the Vatican worked and later became an important advisor to the pontiff. When John Paul died in 2005, Cardinal Bergoglio was considered by some to be a possible successor. He continued his efforts to make the church more responsive to the needs of the poor. In 1206, Frances of Assisi started rebuilding the chapel of San Damiano. At this point, he had no intention of making a career of church work, let alone founding several religious orders. He went from door to door in Assisi begging construction materials. His former friends ridiculed him for adopting a life of poverty and service. They wondered whether this was really what God was asking Francis to do.
One day I heard that Christ told his disciples, "Go forth and proclaim the kingdom of heaven. Take no money with you, nor extra clothes, not even a walking stick or shoes." I wanted to do that with all my heart.
And so he did. He replaced his belt with a rough cord and walked barefoot from town to town, preaching repentance and the vision of God that had come to him at San Damiano. Later, Francis returned to Assisi and started attracting disciples, mostly former friends from the middle and upper classes. At this point, it was by no means clear that he would one day found an important religious order.
I have some for you,
Francis was
but it has
first
to cool
reluctant
down.
to seek official Vatican recognition for his group. He wanted above all to maintain his independence.
Over here. Sit death.
Francis and his disciples spent much of their time wandering through the mountainous regions of Umbria and preaching to the local residents. But they were certainly not the only evangelists in that part of the country. And Francis and his followers did not always receive a warm welcome. Some villagers accused them of heresy and chased them away. Francis decided to take action to protect himself and his disciples. In 1209, Francis led a group of followers to Rome to ask Pope Innocent III for permission to found a religious order. Bishop Guido of Assisi helped to arrange the meeting. Francis and his disciples agreed to submit to church authority and to shave their heads, which would show that they had church approval. Legend has it that Pope Innocent agreed to Francis's request after seeing him in a dream. In that vision, Francis was holding up the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the cathedral church of Rome. This was interpreted to mean that Francis would save the Catholic Church from destruction. Today, the church faces no such danger, but its hierarchical Rome-based structure is confronting a serious crisis. One of the major problems it has to deal with is the aftermath of the child sex abuse scandal involving priests. These crimes were covered up for decades. Then there was the VatiLeaks scandal. The documents that were released raised allegations about corruption and other financial improprieties. Almost immediately after his election, Francis appointed 8 cardinals, including Reinhard Marx of Munich, to a special group to prepare the way for reform of the church bureaucracy. Francis made it clear that from then on the bishops would have more of a say in determining church policy, but the process moved slowly. Did that mean that the Curia was to be sidelined step by step?
Francis knew what he was doing, but he also realized that we need a strong center in Rome. I've been saying that all along. It would be completely counterproductive to weaken either the Pope or the Curia. In a globalized world, that would make no sense at all. But Francis moved ahead slowly but deliberately with a sensible program of decentralization. He encouraged us to do that. You can see that in his discussions with the bishops. He asked them to play a stronger role in their dioceses.
In February 2014, Francis created 19 new cardinals, including many from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This shifted the geographical balance within the church. But critics complained that he had made no radical reforms, such as allowing women to join the priesthood.
Such criticism is ridiculous. It ignores what Francis wanted. He said that priests, bishops, and cardinals should be less bureaucratic. There are lots of important church posts that don't have to be filled by cardinals, bishops, priests, or deacons. Those jobs could be done by lay people. This would include, for example, some positions in the Vatican press office. And women could apply for these jobs, provided that they have the proper professional qualifications.
Francis of Assisi didn't have to concern himself with such problems until a young woman expressed interest in his organization. Chiara di Favarone, better known as Clare, came from a noble family. Her parents wanted her to marry and lead a normal middle-class life. She refused and decided to live in poverty. She met with Francis in secret to discuss this. Clare also donated money for Francis's chapel reconstruction projects. Clare left her parents' house on Palm Sunday, 12/11. Some of Francis's supporters were waiting for her outside the walls of the town, and they took her to the chapel of Porziuncola, which had become the group's spiritual headquarters. She had her hair cut and exchanged her fine clothes for a simple robe and veil. She was now ready to adopt a life of poverty and prayer. Claire's father tried to force her to return home, but she refused. And she told him that she would have no husband but Jesus Christ. Frances and Clare shared the same philosophy. They felt responsible for each other. And like Frances, Clare wanted to work with the poor. Other women soon joined the group, including Clare's sister Caterina. They were known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano. These were the original members of what would become the Order of St. Poverty is a fact of life in big cities around the world, and Buenos Aires is no exception. And people who see no opportunity to improve their lot often turn to drugs. The priests who work in the city's 1114 district have opened a prevention and rehabilitation centre to help such people. Those who want to get off drugs can find support here. The priests also offer job training courses.
They get involved here. We're supposed to create a church for the poor, and this is one of the ways we're doing it.
The centre staff not only help addicts kick their drug habit, they also help people find jobs. The facility has become a haven for those who seek to escape the vicious cycle of poverty, crime and drug abuse. The church plays a much more active role in the slums of Buenos Aires than it does in communities in wealthy countries. Jorge Bergoglio learned much from his work in the capital.
The wind from the south is important for the wealthy north because it shows that a country can be poor, but pious and church-oriented at the same time.
The Pope's new style of leadership had consequences for the Catholic Church in Germany. In 2013, Francis suspended Bishop of Limburg, Franz Peter Thebats von Elst, from office after he spent more than $13 million to renovate his residence and office. That certainly didn't fit with the pontiff's concept of a poor church.
The key question is, what are we supposed to spend our money on? Can we justify these expenses? Are we using our money to help the poor and others who are in need, those who are hungry for an education, those who thirst for a religious faith? I think that as we continue our efforts to proclaim the gospel, we sometimes have to take a more humble approach. That means moving away from language that is assertive, demanding, exclusive, and moving toward language that is humble, welcoming, optimistic, and charitable. That's the approach that Pope Francis took.
St. Francis also tried new ways to expand the scope of his ministry. In 1219, he travelled to Egypt to try to convince the Sultan to convert to Christianity. Reports from that time indicate that the Sultan received Francis graciously and allowed him to preach to his troops, but declined to convert. Buenos Aires is truly a melting pot of various cultures. For example, a Jewish community lives in the Onza district. During his time as cardinal here, Jorge Bergoglio promoted dialogue with both Jews and Muslims. He became good friends with the leader of the city's Jewish community.
Pope Francis believes in dialogue. He believes it is the key element in creating peace.
One of the Pope's primary goals was to promote world peace. He fought against the conflicts in the Middle East in general and in Syria in particular, and in Africa and Ukraine. In September 2013, the Pontiff led a service at St. Peter's Square to pray for peace in Syria. In January 2014, the rabbi of Buenos Aires visited Francis to discuss the Pope's visit to Israel.
I dream of moments of peace like these. Of course, the Pope can't solve all the world's problems. But I wanted Francis to send a clear signal during his visit. A shining light that would convince the Palestinians and Israelis to sit down with each other and find a way to create lasting peace. In fact, the Pope's message should apply to the entire Middle East and to the rest of the world as well.
By 1224, St. Francis's health had begun to decline. The life of poverty that he had led for nearly 2 decades was finally taking its toll. During this time, he wrote the Canticle of the Sun, affirmation of his personal theology.
Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures. Be praised, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who feeds us and rules, produces various fruits with coloured flowers and herbs.
Meanwhile, the Franciscan order of friars continued to grow. Hundreds turned out for the annual observance of the Feast of Pentecost. Francis decided that his organization needed more structure. At the same time, the friars would reaffirm their devotion to poverty and apostolic life. The brothers shall appropriate nothing to themselves, neither a house, nor place, nor anything. And as pilgrims and strangers in this world, let them go confidently in quest of alms. But can today's Catholic Church truly reform itself by adopting a philosophy of poverty and humility? Some in the Vatican disagreed with Pope Francis's reform course.
There are those who criticized the way he did things. There are those who didn't like his choice of words. There was some opposition in the Curia. But I think that this was different from the criticism we'd seen of previous popes. It came from a small group of intellectuals. But at the parish and diocesan level, people liked what Francis was saying and doing.
Un'aria nuova e molto positiva.
These things took some getting used to, but what I admired about Francis was that he wanted to bring everyone on board. He wanted to implement his policies, but he didn't use brute force. That was not his style. He wanted to lead by example. He didn't want a sharp break with the past. He wanted to see things develop.
By night, Buenos Aires glows with neon light. Francis was fully aware that in contemporary society, the Church and its moral philosophy have become less important to many. As the Pope returned to Rome from a youth conference in Brazil, a reporter asked him for his opinion of homosexuality.
If a person is gay and seeks the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge him?
A statement that appeared to contain no hint of discrimination.
It was a spontaneous remark, but I'm sure he'd thought about this topic before. His comment was perfectly acceptable. It was not directed against church dogma or the moral or theological policy of the church.
In Europe and in Latin America, the Catholic Church must admit that its concept of marriage and family is often out of step with contemporary reality. The divorce rate is rising, and more couples are simply living together without making it official. Pope Francis recognized that times had changed. Late in 2015, he convened a synod to discuss Vatican doctrine toward Catholics who divorce. Germany's Cardinal Marx was one of the key negotiators.
These issues are still being discussed. That's why the Pope convened a synod on family policy. It's an international issue. There are so many different cultures involved. He wanted to start the process of dialogue. He didn't want to dictate policy from on high. He wanted to listen to others, and that's why it's so important for the bishops to discuss things openly with each other.
The pontiff made it clear that he didn't want the Vatican to be a royal court, with its intrigues, gossip and cronyism. The bishops should set an example and reach out to others, as Francis himself had done. Frances of Assisi, the servant of God who had reached out to the poor, died on October the 3rd, 1226, in Porziuncola, where his movement had begun. The next day, a cortege bearing his body made its way to Assisi. The procession stopped at San Damiano, so that Clare and her companions could pay their last respects. Francis was buried in a tomb at the Church of San Giorgio. He was canonized in 1228 by Pope Gregory IX and is now considered one of the most venerated figures in the Catholic Church. Francis's companions noted that Pope Gregory came to Assisi himself to announce the canonization. The Pope honored Francis, whom he had loved deeply, not only by canonizing him, but also by laying the cornerstone for a church that would be built in his name. The last thing that Pope Francis wanted was for a personality cult to be built around him. He drew the attention of the church to the power of the cause. He reformed the style and structure of the church and stressed the importance of dialogue.
He remained true to himself. He was the same person as he had been before he became Pope. He didn't want to lead a life of luxury, and he didn't want to go around protected by security people. He wanted to get close to his congregation. He was the Pope because he was the Bishop of Rome, not the other way around.
If we think of a revolution as an event that changes things, then we can call Francis a revolutionary. He wanted to change things. He wanted the church to be less centered on itself and to become an institution that is simpler and more humble. The church should go to the people instead of waiting for the people to come to the church. The church must be active where people are. That sounds simple enough, but the church doesn't always do that. And Pope Francis showed how it could be done.
Francis's approach did much to revise the church's focus to one that serves the people
you got yours.
and plays a pivotal role in the lives of the faithful. He was the poor people's Pope and wrote a new chapter in the history of the Catholic Church. The demands of the papacy changed Francis not in the least. Rather, it was Francis who sought to change the papacy and the church.
Now everyone is asking who is the new pope and where does he come from?
Sibi nomeni posuit Franciscan. Francis. It's the first Francis in the history of the Catholic Church.
The Pope is elected. That's all.